Welcome back, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us for this explainer because today we are unpacking a topic that is literally reshaping how we think about the future of our planet. We're going to explore how centuries of indigenous resistance and the ongoing fight for land sovereignty have actually evolved into some of the most critical, scientifically backed climate solutions of the modern era. We're tracking this journey from historical battlefields to modern courtrooms and straight into the forests and oceans that sustain all of us. Okay, let's dive into this by posing a really critical question, one that sits right at the center of the global conservation crisis. Who protects nature best? For a long time, the default answer in global policy was that governments and strictly fenced-off national parks were the gold standard. But as we're going to see today, the data is telling us a completely different story.
If you thought those strictly fenced-off national parks were the heavyweight champions of carbon storage, well, think again. Data from Mungabay reveals this pretty staggering reality. Indigenous lands and protected areas sequester nearly all of the carbon across the entire Amazon basin. Let that sink in for a second. The vast majority of the region's climate-stabilizing power is concentrated precisely in territories stewarded by indigenous communities. It's an outsized impact that completely shifts our understanding of environmental protection. And the crucial point here is that these conservation victories, they aren't just a lucky coincidence. Research consistently shows us that secure indigenous land rights directly lead to healthier forests, drastically curbing deforestation, and restoring whole ecosystems. Basically, when communities have that secure legal authority over their homelands, biodiversity just thrives. But to truly understand how this works as a modern climate solution, we actually have to step back and recognize that it's built on a centuries-old fight for survival. Which brings us to Section 1, Centuries of Historical Resistance, looking at the historical roots. Because the push to protect these lands isn't some recent environmental trend, it is deeply rooted in generations of historical resistance. Looking back through history really highlights the immense scale and endurance of this resistance across completely different continents and eras. Back in 1553, the Mapuche people successfully defended their territory against Spanish colonizers down in South America. Then jump to 1680 in North America, and you have the Pueblo Revolt, which successfully, albeit temporarily, expelled Spanish forces and restored indigenous control over land and religion in the Southwest. Fast forward to 1881 in New Zealand, where the Parihaka settlement utilized peaceful, nonviolent resistance against land confiscation. And in 1963, the Yolngu people in Australia presented the Yirrkala Bark petitions, brilliantly bridging indigenous law and art to challenge mining on their land. It's a continuous, unbroken thread of defending ancestral territory. And that unbroken thread weaves its way right out of those historical battlefields and straight into 20th century courtrooms, bringing us to Section 2, Landmark Legal Turning Points and Landmark Decisions. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive paradigm shift we've seen. For centuries, colonial legal frameworks like the doctrine of discovery or terra nullius, which is basically the idea that land belonged to literally no one before European arrival, were used to justify dispossession. But over the last several decades, things have fundamentally changed. Indigenous communities have successfully dismantled these long-standing doctrines in court, replacing them with legal frameworks based on native title, treaty rights, and formally recognized sovereignty. Probably one of the most famous examples of this is the 1992 Mabo Decision. Led by Eddie Mabo, this was a landmark legal victory for the Meriam people that literally rewrote Australian law. It officially overturned that whole myth of terra nullius, once and for all, legally recognizing native title for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It was an absolute game changer that opened the door for traditional owners to finally regain control over their country. Meanwhile, over in the United States, the 1974 Boldt Decision was another monumental courtroom victory. The ruling affirmed that Washington state tribes had treaty rights to harvest up to 50% of the harvestable fish in their usual and accustomed waters. 50%! And this wasn't just about catching fish. It firmly intertwined tribal sovereignty with the actual right to co-manage and protect the natural habitats that sustain those fisheries in the first place. So those hard-fought legal battles laid the absolutely critical groundwork for what we're seeing today. That brings us to Section 3, the modern land back movement and territorial returns. You've probably heard the term land back floating around. Now, land back does mean the physical return of ancestral lands, sure, but it is so much more than a real estate transaction. It is fundamentally about the restoration of indigenous governance, the revival of culture, and the implementation of co-stewardship. It's really about restoring a deeply rooted system of ecological care.
And we are seeing some incredibly inspiring milestones happening right now. For instance, the Washoe tribe recently acquired 10,000 acres in California to create the Welmelty Preserve, effectively returning long-term stewardship to those sagebrush and forest ecosystems. Or look at the Yurok tribe, who have regained management authority over vast swaths of their northern Californian homelands. And up in Canada, the Haida Nation just secured a historic title agreement recognizing their absolute authority over Haida Gwaii. These aren't just concepts, these are tangible, real-world examples of the land-back movement in motion today. So what happens when the land is actually returned? How does this sovereignty directly translate into actionable conservation? Let's pivot to Section 4, Indigenous Stewardship in Action, Restoring the Land. Now, what's really interesting about this process is how it flips our modern understanding of forest management. We usually think of fire as a forest's ultimate enemy, right? But for indigenous groups like the Zurente in Brazil's Cerrado region and the Karuk and Yurok tribes out in California, fire is actually a vital healing tool. By applying ancestral knowledge and conducting controlled burns during very specific seasons, they're actively clearing underbrush, restoring the health of the soil, and crucially, preventing the kind of catastrophic megafires that are just devastating unmanaged forest today. Going back to the Yurok tribe for a second, they're using their restored land authority to actively revive salmon habitats that had been degraded for decades. They are out there systematically removing invasive species and restoring native prairies. This is exactly what active, on-the-ground stewardship looks like. It's a tangible environmental victory made possible only through the formal recognition of their sovereignty. And all this local action, it is translating into some serious global diplomacy. Take the COP30 climate summit in Brazil, where there was record indigenous participation. Leaders from all across the globe presented unified demands. They want direct conservation funding rather than having the money routed through outside intermediaries. They're fighting for stronger protections against extractive industries like illegal logging and mining. And most importantly, they are reframing the whole debate, arguing that the formal demarcation of indigenous land isn't just a human rights issue. It is a vital, non-negotiable climate policy for the entire planet. And we have to remember, this stewardship isn't limited to just the forests and the plains. It extends right out to the global oceans. During the High Seas Treaty negotiations, indigenous leaders, including Solomon Pili Kahawalahala, championed this incredibly powerful sentiment. We belong to one ocean. They successfully argued that marine conservation absolutely must include indigenous knowledge, and it has to respect the deeply ingrained cultural relationships that coastal communities have always had with marine life. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. The data, the history, and the lived realities on the ground all point to one totally undeniable fact. Indigenous stewardship is a critical, scientifically proven solution for global conservation. So the question we are left with is this. As the climate crisis accelerates, how quickly will global policies actually evolve to fully respect and fund this sovereignty? The link between historical justice and our planet's future resilience is right in front of us. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this vital topic today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.